My mother said it on a Tuesday, the way she said most cruel things, pleasantly while passing the bread. You know, Renee, she told my sister across the dinner table, your sister has never had your instincts. You're twice the woman she is, honestly. Always have been. She corrected herself a breath later. Well, Renee is half no. What I mean is, Dana, you're simply not half the woman your sister is. I set down my fork. The table had that particular Tuesday night layout. The good placemats Mom only used when Renee visited, the ceramic serving dish she'd stopped using when it was just me coming by, the candles lit even though it was a weeknight. Renee was home from Columbus for 4 days. Everything had been arranged to honor that. I picked up my napkin. I folded it once, set it beside my plate. I looked at my father. He was looking at his food. He hadn't looked up since the salad course, which was his way of managing dinners that were going in a direction he didn't want to name. I'd watched him do it for 30 years. Then I pushed my chair back. Then she can start paying your rent, I said. The room didn't go loud. It went the other kind of quiet, the kind that has a texture. Dad looked up from his plate for the first time since the salad course. His face did something I hadn't seen it do in years. It lost its color in a single second, starting at the jaw and moving upward. Rent, he said. What rent? My name is Dana Kowalczyk. I was 34 years old that Tuesday, and I was a contracts administrator for a mid-size logistics company based out of Dearborn. I had my own apartment on the second floor of a 2-flat on Birchfield Avenue. I paid my bills on the first of the month, kept a small savings account I added to whenever I had room, and drove a 6-year-old Civic that I'd bought used and paid off in 3 years. I was also, quietly, paying $460 a month toward my parents' rent on the house they'd lived in for 22 years in Westlake. This had started 31 months earlier, when my father's hours at the distribution center were cut and my mother's part-time work at the dental office ended the same season. They hadn't asked exactly. My mother had mentioned on a phone call in October that they weren't sure how they were going to manage the January renewal on the lease. She'd said it the way she said things she wanted addressed without appearing to ask. A statement pointed at a solution, waiting for someone to volunteer. I had volunteered. My sister Renee was 29 and lived in Columbus, where she worked in marketing for a wellness brand that sold supplements I'd never heard of. She made, as far as I could tell, about what I made, possibly more. She had a boyfriend, a lease on a 1-bedroom in the short north, and a personality that made every room feel like it had been rearranged in her favor. She had not volunteered. No one had called her. As far as I knew, no one had thought to. Renee was the kind of daughter my mother described to other people. She had the right laugh, the right haircut, the right way of walking into a room and making my mother feel like the room's most important person. She remembered to send flowers on Mother's Day, 2 days early, with a card that always made my mother cry in the good way. I sent a card too. Mine arrived on time. The difference in how these things landed had been a fact of my life for long enough that I had stopped flinching at it. I noticed it the way you notice a ceiling you've looked at for years. It was just the shape of the room. 31 months is a long time to carry something without it being named. I had moved my parents into their Westlake house the summer I turned 24, when Dad's back gave out and the apartment they'd been in had stairs they couldn't manage anymore. I'd borrowed a pickup truck from a coworker, driven 2 weekends in a row, and gotten the furniture in without hiring anyone because the money was tight and I was young enough to manage it. That fall I'd fixed the bathroom faucet when the landlord took 3 weeks to respond. I'd bought the weather stripping for the back door and installed it myself on a Saturday in November, watching a video on my phone, doing it twice because the first time I got the angle wrong. When Mom's car needed a brake job the following spring, I drove out on a Friday night after work, took it to a shop I trusted in Lakewood, waited 2 hours and drove it back. Mom had offered to pay me back. I'd said not to worry about it. She hadn't brought it up again. There was a file on my phone, a folder labeled Documents, House, that I'd started at the beginning of the rent arrangement. I hadn't told anyone it existed. It held the transfer confirmations going back to the first month, time-stamped and sorted by year. I'd added to it the way I added to the savings account, quietly, consistently, without expecting anyone to ask. The rent arrangement had formalized what had already been the structure of things. I was the one who showed up. I was the one who answered the call. Not because I'd been asked to be, exactly, but because I had been the one standing there when the moment required someone, and I had not been able to make myself walk past it. Dad worked reduced hours. Mom picked up occasional shifts when the dental office called her in for coverage. Together they could manage most of the lease, most months. My $460 covered the gap, and in months when something extra came up, a copay, a car registration, a broken appliance, I absorbed that too, quietly, in ways that didn't require a conversation. Renee called on birthdays and holidays and sent the good flowers on Mother's Day. I fixed the weather stripping. There was a particular Saturday in February, about 14 months into the arrangement, when I drove out to help Dad move a cabinet from the basement up to the spare room. He needed it for storage, and his back meant he couldn't do it alone. We got it up the stairs in 20 minutes. Afterward, we sat in the kitchen, and he made instant coffee, and we didn't talk much, just sat with the sound of the furnace running and the gray February light coming through the window over the sink. He'd said at one point, "I don't know what we'd do." I hadn't answered. I'd looked at the window and drunk my coffee and let it sit there. That was the closest either of my parents had ever come to naming what I did. Renee's Tuesday visit had been planned for 2 weeks. Mom had texted me 9 days before with the dinner date, and I'd cleared my evening and driven the 22 minutes out to Westlake the way I did most times I was asked to come. The good placemats were out. The candles were lit. Renee arrived 20 minutes late in a new coat, and Mom went to the door to meet her the way she went to the door for no one else. Dinner was roast chicken, which was Renee's favorite, and also a meal I'd made for my parents 6 times over the last 2 years when I came to cook on Sundays and the fridge was low. No one mentioned this. The comparison started gently, the way it always did, not as a blade but as a category, a warm accounting of Renee's qualities delivered to the table the way someone might read from a list they'd been keeping. Renee's instincts. Renee's energy. The way Renee handled herself in a room. I served myself more chicken and let it move around me. "She just has a way," Mom said, to no one in particular. "She always has." "Mom," Renee said, but she was smiling. "I'm just saying what's true." Mom passed the bread. "Dana, you know what I mean. You've always known your sister was the one who, well." She set the bread down. "You're simply not half the woman Renee is. And I think you've always understood that." Something went still in my chest. Not a tightening, not the old familiar pull toward the door, but something flatter and more final, like a door closing on a room I'd been trying to keep warm for a long time. I looked at my sister. Renee was looking at her plate. I looked at my father. He was cutting his chicken. I set down my fork. I picked up my napkin. I folded it once, precisely, and placed it beside my plate. Then I pushed my chair back. "Then she can start paying your rent," I said. "Dana," my mother said. "The rent on this house." I was looking at my father now. $4,600 over the last 10 months. Before that, 21 months at the same rate. "I can get you the exact total if you need it." Dad's fork went down. "What rent?" he said. "What are you, Margaret? What is she talking about?" Mom's face had done something complicated. The warmth hadn't left it entirely, but it had rearranged itself into a different shape, something more careful. "We had an arrangement," she said. "Dana and I. It's been very helpful to us, and I think." "An arrangement," Dad said. "It wasn't a secret," Mom said, and the word secret came out precisely, placed with the kind of care that meant she'd considered it. "I didn't know," Dad said. He was looking at me. "No," I said. "You didn't." Renee looked up from her plate. "Dana, I didn't know either." "I know," I said. "How long?" Dad asked. 31 months, I said. The candles were still burning. The chicken was getting cold. Mom straightened the bread basket. "You've always been so capable," she said, and her voice had returned to its warm register, the one she used when she was managing a situation rather than responding to it. "That's what I've always said about you. You handle things. That's your gift, Dana. Renee has other gifts." I stood very still. "Margaret," Dad said. I'm not saying anything wrong, she said. Dana understands her role in this family. She always has. She's been a wonderful support to us, and I think calling it a secret is deeply unfair when it's been a private arrangement between two adults that her father didn't know about. Gordon, please don't raise your voice at the table. He hadn't raised his voice. He was still speaking at the same level he always spoke at. But Mom said it anyway, the way she sometimes did, to establish that the temperature had risen, so that anything said next would be measured against that claim. I was still standing. She's not half of anything, Dad said quietly. Mom set the bread basket down. I wasn't being unkind. I was being honest about. You were being ungrateful, I said. The word landed differently than I expected. Not loud. Just placed. Mom looked at me. That's what you've always called it, I said. When someone doesn't perform the way you think they should. When I don't show up with the right energy or the right flowers or the right timing. Ungrateful was always the word for that. I kept my voice level. I've been paying the lease on the house where you called me half of what my sister is. And you used my word. No one spoke, the furnace ran. One of the candles flickered. Renee put down her fork very slowly. I drove home that night on the Westlake-Lakewood connector, through the lit intersections on Center Ridge Road, past the gas stations and the dollar stores and the strip mall with the nail salon that had been there since I was 12. I stopped for gas at the Marathon on Clog Road at 9:47 p.m. I swiped my card at the pump. I watched the numbers turn. I got back in the car. I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the heat on. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. I opened the folder labeled Documents, House. I looked at the file name without opening it. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. I drove home. I parked in my spot on Birchfield. I went upstairs. I washed my face, made a glass of water, set it on my nightstand. I got into bed with the light off and lay on my back and looked at the ceiling. 3 days later, Mom called and said she thought we should all clear the air before things calcified, and could I come to lunch on Saturday? I said I could. She had called it a family lunch. When I arrived at the house on Westlake, Renee's rental car was in the driveway. Dad opened the door. I didn't know, he said again before I was even inside. I know, I said. We sat in the living room. Mom had made tea. Renee was on the couch with her coat still on, which meant she hadn't been there long and hadn't fully committed to staying. Dad sat in the chair by the window. Mom sat across from me at the coffee table, her hands around her mug. I set my canvas bag beside the chair. I put my hands in my lap. Mom was looking at the table. Dad was looking at the window. Renee was looking at me. I want to say, Mom started, that I've thought about Tuesday, and I think some things came out in a way that wasn't. I have something I want to show you, I said, guarantor with a qualifying income, and Renee was in Columbus. Renee looked at the phone. I saw her lips move slightly, counting. Dana, Mom said, I don't think this is necessary. We all know what the arrangement. You called me half of what my sister is, I said. At a dinner table where I'd been paying the lease for 2.5 years. I didn't mean it the way you. You said it plainly, I said. And you meant it plainly. You've meant it my whole life. The flowers I sent never arrived 2 days early. I wasn't the right shape of daughter for what you were performing at that table. I kept my hands still. But I was the shape of daughter who showed up when the lease needed a guarantor. And I kept showing up. Renee said, Dana, I'm sorry. I genuinely didn't. I know you didn't, I said. That's not what today is. Dad said, What do you want, Dana? I looked at him. I want you to know what happened. That's all. I'm not asking for anything back. I'm not making a demand. I'm just making sure everyone in this room knows what the last 31 months actually looked like. Mom set her mug down. You've made your point. You said I was ungrateful, I told her. At the table. When I said it back to you. I said no such thing. You've said it my whole life, I said. When I wasn't what you needed me to be. When I didn't perform correctly. Ungrateful was always the word for that. I looked at the phone, then back at her. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you have a daughter who's easier to love and a daughter who's easier to use, and you confused one arrangement for the other. Mom's face had gone very still. What Renee has, I said, I've never been able to give you. I know that. But what I gave you was real, and it was mine, and it was enough to keep this house. I picked up the phone. I picked up the envelope. I put them both back in the bag. I think that's worth knowing. I stood up. Dad stood up too, which I hadn't expected. I'll walk you out, he said. At the door, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder. He didn't say anything else. I didn't need him to. 7 months after that Tuesday dinner, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment on Birchfield Avenue on a Saturday morning, the November light coming gray and flat through the window over the sink, my coffee going cold beside me. I had a fireproof document box on the table in front of me, a gray metal one I'd bought at the office supply store on Detroit Avenue the week after the Saturday lunch. I was updating the contents. There was the original lease agreement with my name as guarantor, the transfer records printed and paper-clipped by year, and the letter I'd sent the following month formally releasing myself as guarantor at the next renewal term, which the landlord had processed without incident. The box closed with a small click. I left it on the table and sat for a moment with my hands around my mug. My mother had sent a text in September. It said, I've been thinking about things. I'd like to talk when you're ready. I had read it sitting in my car outside the grocery store on a Thursday evening. I had put my phone in my bag and gone inside and bought what I needed for the week. I hadn't answered. I didn't think of it as a decision so much as the natural settling of something that had already decided itself. Renee had called once in August. We'd talked for almost an hour. She asked questions I didn't have easy answers to, and I gave her the honest ones instead, and by the end of the call something had shifted between us in a way I couldn't fully name but could feel in the absence of the old tightness. We'd talked twice more since then. I didn't know what that would become. I was leaving room for it. Dad had driven to Birchfield in October, unannounced, with a grocery bag of things from the Indian grocery on Lorraine because he'd remembered I liked the rice crackers they carried. He'd stayed for 40 minutes. We'd talked about his hours, which had been restored, and about the used Buick he was thinking about and whether the mileage was worth it. When he left, he stood at the door for a moment longer than necessary, and then he went. I kept the document box on the shelf in my bedroom closet beside the extra blankets after that. I didn't look at it often. But I knew what was in it, every transfer, every date, my name on the guarantee line, and knowing it was there had become a different kind of thing than it used to be. Not a record kept in case of a fight. Just a record. Something that had happened, witnessed, and filed. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. They just need to be witnessed, once, by the right people. The rest takes care of itself. If this story put a name to something you've been carrying without a word for it, pass it to someone who might need it,